Hello, everybody. This is Johna Johnson. I'm the CEO of Nemertes Research, and with me is Marc Seybold, who is a Nemertes Research Fellow. We are not appearing on video due to some technical difficulties, but we have some absolutely fabulous slides to share with you in our Emerging Technologies series on Internet of Things. Um, and we have a fairly extensive set of things to cover, but certainly do check the attached links for some other places to go and explore and learn a few more things, and also to register for the rest of our Emerging Technologies series. We're sharing information with you as we dig it up from our interviews and research with the cutting edge labs and practitioners. So all of this is, just hot off the presses, so to speak. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. This is, of course, the Internet of Things, Emerging Technologies. Our agenda is to cover the current state. So I have the boring primary research stuff telling you what enterprise organizations are currently doing with IoT. And then we jump into the fun, exciting stuff that Marc will share with you about some of the key themes and future directions. Since you can actually read, the bullet items here really have to do with greater compute cycles, more mobility, more security, more uses, and really key, and Marc will explain why, is lower power consumption. And we do have additional resources that you're able to get if you reach out to us. We've got curated lists of resources, further reading, and companies to explore. So with that, just a couple things from our most recent research study. We asked enterprises what their top spending priorities were for last year. And the top one was, as you can see, IoT cloud services and analytics. They're also extremely interested in IoT cybersecurity and management and network infrastructure. And then you can read the rest of them yourselves. But the key thing to us is that this is concrete proof that IoT has moved past the sort of provocative stage and into the production stage, because when you're starting to worry about how to secure and support something for real scalability, that's when you start spending a lot of time and energy looking at cybersecurity and network infrastructure and services. So kind of the takeaway from this slide, even though it's a little bit of a boring bar chart, is that enterprises are taking IoT seriously. And if you're not, this is probably something you should do. What exactly are some of these use cases that people are thinking about? The top one here is virtual reality and augmented reality, which is a component of IoT. If you think about it, the only way that you can bring real reality into your virtual world is by instrumenting that reality. And I'll do a quick side note. About 10 years ago, let's see, this is 2022, so more like 12 years ago, one of my clients asked me, Johna, what do you think the next big thing is in the internet? And for a little bit of context, back in the 1980s, I was beating the drums about the importance of the internet to the general population, despite the fact that several people were telling me I was nuts. And so I would like to highlight well, I may be nuts, but that actually did happen. All that said, I thought for a couple of minutes and I said the answer is instrumenting reality. And when you look at VR and AR, that's in fact exactly what's going on, is that we are instrumenting reality. Um, and a second big use case is human health and telemedicine, particularly in the context of COVID. We see lots of things where companies are getting smart buildings that are able to quickly identify, for example, where somebody's running a temperature, or having automated or semi-automated robots for sanitizing purposes, and things like ultraviolet C sanitizers that can kill bugs as you walk through the door. So all of that is happening. They're also using IoT for capacity planning, which really comes back to this instrumenting reality. If you know how many parcels are coming in, you can make sure you have trucks or trains to carry them. If you know how many trucks or trains are coming in, you can actually adjust your port size to handle it. Unless you're the United States, which has trouble with that basic functionality, and you end up with supply chain shortages due to shipping issues. But that's a longer conversation and really doesn't have anything to do with technology. Also, folks are looking at things like precision action, things like cobots, human operated robots. You might be listening to this going, what does that have to do with IoT? Well, guess what? The device that you're operating actually has to have plenty of sensors involved to understand the environment in which it's being operated, and of course, plenty of actuators so it can get moved around. So think about the possibility, for example, of a someone being a server at a McDonald's who is actually operating a cobot from his basement or her basement and delivering that burger to you where you're sitting in the cubicle. Those kinds of things are scenarios that can actually work. So those are some of the key use cases that people are seeing in the enterprise. If you do a double click down into that smart buildings where I talked about, one of the key top use cases is that whole biometric access to buildings. And that is that whole question of letting people in based on their retinal scans or based on fingerprints or other biometric measures. We're also looking at automatically controlling energy in buildings, automatically turning off lights when people are no longer in the room, or warming up a room when it's time for a conference to be held. I mentioned sanitizer robots already and temperature scanners. We're also seeing smart vehicle chargers and biometric access within buildings, which is useful for internal bulkheading. That's useful for all kinds of applications, including here in the United States, sadly, active shooters, where you can actually lock up rooms and bulkhead rooms if there's an active shooter present, or hallways if there's an active shooter present. As sad as it is to have to think about, people are thinking about it. And then all the rest of them. The one thing I want to highlight here is, with the exception of biometric access to buildings, which is fairly common already, most of these are at about the 30% planned use case, which is to say, we're just at the point where people are jumping in. Um, and so I would say that you should expect to see an awful lot of facility security evolving very quickly, and smart facilities evolving very quickly with IoT over the coming weeks, months, and years. So this is really at an inflection point. So if you're in the infrastructure or cybersecurity space, you really want to be thinking a lot about how you're going to be blending in intelligent facilities and IoT into your tower or portfolio of responsibilities, because it's happening sooner rather than later. Last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about IoT architecture. And the reason I want to talk about this is, what I found with my clients who are implementing IoT is that, in general, most organizations are getting their architecture from the vendors. And it's not a great solution because of the, three blind men and the elephant problem, or the, hammer and nail problem. In other words, every vendor only sees the world as as it is accustomed to seeing. So you have the scenario where you can't really build a vendor independent comprehensive architecture if you're relying on a single vendor or set of vendors in a particular area to think about the architecture. So I will cheerfully admit that this is our bias as infrastructure specialists, but I would highlight the fact that the general IoT architecture starts from left to right. So remember, I mentioned the sensors and actuators previously. Just a reminder, sensors are things that sense. So they are monitors of temperature, humidity, space, vision, anything from a camera to a temperature monitor to a vibration sensor. Any of those things are sensors. Actuators are, as the name would imply, things that take action, generally associated with robots or cobots, but not exclusively. So they can be locks, for example, that unlock. Now, you may think that sensors and actuators are part and parcel of the same architecture, but they're not. Often you end up buying them from different vendors, and they operate on entirely different networks. Those are those green blobs in the middle there, or actually green multiple arrows in the middle. And sometimes the information gets from the sensors to the analytics, going left to right, and from the analytics to the actuators. And there may be a latency in between those two networks, which is something to think about. So, one thing to think about is, what is the network my actuators and sensors are on? Is it a wireless network? Is it a wired network? How are they connected? What are the characteristics of that network? Then you may have an edge computing device. In fact, we see that edge computing is an extremely fast growing area of interest in next generation networks, which may include an IoT messaging bus and an IoT database. The reason the database would be living there is actually so that you can get information faster than going all the way up to the cloud and back, which is what current implementations do. And the latency of going up to the cloud and back is often too high to get the response back to the sensors and actuators. Um, there is typically an integration component there that will then tie everything you've got from the IoT world into ERP and other corporate applications. So if you're using Salesforce or ServiceNow to automate components of what you're doing, or SAP, obviously, if you're a manufacturing organization, that integration ties all your IoT resources into that application. You also want to layer on top of that a visualization, analytics, and dashboarding capabilities. And finally, get that information into a data lake, which may also be capturing information from other sources, not just from your IoT, so that you can actually use all of the information to make informed decisions. By the way, back over to the left, the other purple thing, all the purple things are applications, and the green things are databases, by the way, or data storage, in case you're wondering the color coding. You have the management networks, agents, and applications to manage and monitor the IoT infrastructure, which is incredibly important. And then wrapped around all of that is IoT cybersecurity, which is a burgeoning field all on its own. And we could talk your ear off about that, and may yet do at another webinar. So basically, all of the things that you want to think about are connected via networks, databases, integration with applications, and management dashboarding. And now we're going to talk a little bit about what some of those things might be. And Marc is having massive technical difficulties. So, Marc, I don't know if you want to give it a shot to try to talk through this, or you want me to go ahead and take it away.
I'm gonna take a shot at it. I have a funny feeling somebody around me is zapping me with a microwave oven or something like that, but that they seem to have finished cooking. Um, okay, so the primary driver for advances in IoT is semiconductors. It's what allows completely novel new sensors to be created or extremely inexpensive versions of very large desktop systems like mass spectrometers. There are a number of semiconductors out there that are close to what a tabletop version of a mass spectrometer will do, and it could be integrated on a chip level device. So that's going to be a pretty big game changer when those things advance. Semiconductor advances are also what we have to thank for the energy harvesting, the fact that we can build these things now and not have batteries in them. And that's a total game changer. The need to either run active power or to have somebody run around and recharge batteries or replace them or have some kind of solar power to do them is a huge cost differentiator for these things. Ultra wideband has been in use for a while now in car key fabs, but it's also moving forward into the Wi-Fi standards and into our cell phones. And the interesting thing there is it operates in the lower range of where radars do. And so that means it's really useful for things like very accurate location. Apple's been using that in their Apple AirTags when you actually use an iPhone to find them, to triangulate the exact location within a few centimeters. It's also possible to do things like sensing respiration and heart rate. You can, if you're in an energy shortage situation, like where there's just not a lot of power because you are using batteries or the energy harvesting, they can chirp data and in a very brief moment generate a very large amount of data transmission. They're also extremely secure. It's why they're used in the car key fabs. We've got a couple of companies and universities that are working on insect-sized machines. Most of them can fly. Some of them are kind of like cockroaches and can crawl. It's even one company that's reverse engineering the brains of the bee in order to give it the same level of intelligence. Some of the other sensor advances that are coming are actually out of quantum mechanics, where incredible sensitivity can be now installed in something that's the size of your fingernail. So again, that goes back to the semiconductor advances. The cloud is moving to the edge when it comes to the IoTs. People realize pretty quickly that the volume of data and the bandwidth requirements, you couldn't centralize that. It really does have to move out to the edge. And Kubernetes K3 is a very big part of that. That seems to be the standard. And I noticed somebody did ask about standards. And like a lot of fields, there are a lot of them. The home automation systems are a lot further along in terms of plug and play than the industrial ones, where it's still more proprietary. But all of the standards organizations, IEEE, ISO, those groups have works in progress. So eventually it will be possible to just plug and play these things randomly. But that's not quite here yet, even at the home level. The biggest fields where these things are making a difference are definitely healthcare, monitoring of patients in hospitals, things like the iWatches and the Samsung smartwatches that can do EKGs, pulse. Some of them, they're not legal yet, or they're not licensed by the FDA for approval, but it looks like we'll see glucose monitoring in real time without having to actually penetrate the skin, probably in the next 12 to 18 months. The devices already exist, but they're going through FDA trials to try and get certified. Manufacturing 4.0, that's a big thing. Factory of the future is actually here. Smart cities are also very underrated. A lot of the improvements we see in traffic congestion inside cities, power savings from the way streetlights are automated, transportation systems, all of those things we can thank IoT for. Even down to, in some cities like New York, you can get micro forecasts because it's a large enough place that the weather is not identical in all parts of it. And then after that, there's a very large collection of smaller niches. And in the end, that collection of niches is probably what's going to dominate, because
Well,
they'll
I would actually
wow.
disagree somewhat, because what we found is every enterprise has smart buildings, so smart building is too big to be a niche. Also, for the person that asked about the standards, I've noted that and will happily highlight that with a list of relevant standards at the end. So we do have some of those. But let's just jump ahead, because Mark, I know you have lots more good stuff. Tell us a bit about Risk 5 and where it's going.
Okay, so this one's an eye chart, so we're not going to read it. We're going to try and go quickly through it. So Risk 5 is a project that started at this point about 15 years out of Berkeley. It was to design a risk chip that could totally maximize what reduced instruction set computing, that's what RISC stands for, was capable of. And it's taken them a very long period of time, but they totally open sourced it. So it's license free. There's no intellectual property associated with it. Anybody can create implementations of it. The Chinese had already been moving heavily into it before the US sanctions, and now they've gone all in. And that's significant because it means there's a lot of manufacturing and a lot of talent being devoted to polish it. The full instruction set architecture is much more than just the computer chip itself. And so that's really accelerated it. DARPA did something that was pretty interesting. A few years back, they ran a contest basically to design hack-proof CPUs. And an academic group came out the winner. They designed a variation of the RISC-V chip called Morpheus. And then DARPA invited 500 invitation-only hackers to try and break it. Not one of them were able to get in. So that's pretty impressive. And the type of defense they provide is against dynamic code injection. So something like the Israeli NSO attack on the iPhones, if people are familiar with that one, Morpheus would have prevented that. It would not prevent something like SolarWinds, where
And of course, I'm on mute exactly when Mark gets cut out, because there are people operating microwaves in his immediate vicinity. But as Mark was saying, it would not have helped with something like solar winds. So basically, the big takeaway, and I think Mark is back. Are you
yep,
back,
I'm
Mark?
back. Yep, yep.
Okay. So the big
Uh,
takeaway of this slide, and then we'll jump to the next one.
sure. Is Intel's made a huge bet when Apple.
Intel's made a huge bet, and Mark just disappeared, so we'll jump to the next one. So parasitic energy harvesting. This is actually a really, really big deal. It's a game changer for IoT, because the basic idea is you're picking up energy out of the air. And if that sounds goofy, it's real. It brings kind of the Bradbury quote about any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Essentially, you can pick up things like, you can pick up energy from ambient radio frequency RF emissions, anything like mechanical motion, like a self-winding watch, like heat and heat differentials. And the really killer thing here is that there are chips doing this on the market today. And Marc, if you're back, any
Yep.
comments you want to make?
No, except that I think the guy that actually made that quote was Arthur C. Clarke.
Oh my gosh, you are so right. Okay, okay, let this be noted. This is the day that Johna got her famous science fiction writers wrong. At least I didn't attribute it to Heinlein.
No. But the sock chips, it's interesting that this isn't a futurist thing. It's
Yeah.
commercial off-the-shelf technology now. People can integrate that into their IoT devices. So ultra wideband, because I'm also keeping an eye on the clock. We kind of covered that in the earlier slide, so I think we can skip forward and catch up some time.
Okay, here we go. And robobees, your favorite topic.
Okay, my favorite. So this gives definitely a new meaning to swarms. These things are literally the size of actual insects. Some of them are dragonfly sized, and some of them are bumblebee sized. But the fact that people are actively working on reverse engineering the bee brains, there's one academic spinoff that's pretty far in that. And they've actually got the visual system and part of the muscular system going. And the intent is to actually have a very small version of AI that would duplicate what bees do. And that might not seem like a lot, but we've got to remember that bees are capable of doing energy optimal foraging strategies when they're looking for something. In their case, it's pollen and honey. Um, they can randomly move to whatever path they want that gets them to where they're looking for and find those food sources, and then they can literally make a beeline straight back. It's where our expression comes from. They don't have to retrace. They're capable of doing navigation that gets them the shortest path back to the hive. And then once they get there, they're able to do a kind of it's called a waggle dance that shows the other bees not only what they found, the quality of it, but also the directions. So imagine being able to put that in something the size of a bee, or for that matter, in one of the Boston Dynamics robots, and all of a sudden be able to instruct the thing, go out and find me something, whatever that something is. And then it takes a random walk looking for the thing. And when it finds it, it comes back and it says, I found it, this is where it is, and how much of it and the quality of it, or put it in their robo dogs. Maybe that's a better robot to put that kind of thing in.
Well, the Boston Dynamics guys do have robo dogs.
Yep, they do have the robo dogs. Which, if anybody saw the two commercials that they were in at the Super Bowl, you've seen the dogs and their actual human form robots. Pretty cool stuff.
I
So,
missed the Super Bowl, but I've been an aficionado of the YouTube channel. So if you missed it, just go Google it. It's great. We would show it to you, but doing videos on webinar platforms is sometimes sketchy. But go look it up. It's really fantastic.
definitely. Um, so
So
go ahead.
oh, I just skipped you ahead to the use cases and impacts of some of these robobees.
Yeah, so one possibility is that these things, because you've got neuromorphic chips, basically they're trying to mimic the way actual neurons work, as opposed to just the really fast vector multiplying machines that we see as accelerators and the computer graphic chips that are being used today. So what happens when you tie this kind of intelligence together? The future for the IoT devices is definitely to be able to integrate the data at the point that it's being collected, and then have conversations with other devices that are doing the same thing, and then feed that the same way the brain kind of creates these cascades until you get to the higher levels. But if you've got billions of devices, now you're in the same range as the number of human neurons. Something interesting is bound to emerge. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. It's not that Skynet is likely to come out of it, or we certainly hope not, but something that we can anticipate is almost certain to happen when you have some amount of intelligence and tie billions of things together that have that. There'll definitely be emergent properties. Life safety, I mean, the idea of pervasively being able to locate people in buildings for first responders, that's a total game changer. One of the biggest issues for firemen is always the amount of smoke that's occluding everything. And as we saw at a real tragedy in New York City a few weeks back, all all of the people that died in a high-rise fire, it was smoke inhalation. They didn't die from the fire itself. They weren't burned. And so being able to quickly locate people, whether it's using ultra-wideband or things like the Apple AirTags or different technologies is very important, including sending in mobile IoT devices that can scan directly. Inventory tracking, a lot of that's already going down, but given the level of theft that we're seeing from companies like UPS and Postal Service and FedEx and DHL and those guys, it's only a matter of time before you start seeing tags in the more expensive and valuable devices, if for no other reason to isolate the people that are doing the stealing and use that as part of the criminal prosecutions. Time of flight cameras are something that's been flying under the radar for a lot of people, but there's a startup that's going after the automotive market, which today is almost totally mechanical LiDARs. So LiDARs are basically a form of radar, except using a laser beam to do the scanning instead of a radio frequency for that. But they've got a lot of limitations. Their accuracy is not that good. Obviously, they don't work so well in varying weather conditions. And most of all, the amount of time it takes to do the scanning, because it is a mechanical process, is fairly high. And all of that extra mechanical stuff adds to the cost of these things. And the lag can result in dangerous accidents or maneuvers in some instances. So time of flight cameras is the same thing that we've seen in the current iPhones, and some of the higher end Samsungs, I believe, also have them. And what they basically do is take the imaging sensors and use the responding photons to be able to calculate an accurate distance. Now, not only can that make the self-driving cars a lot safer, but if you've got them in all cameras, one of the things they're used for is to create an accurate 3D wireframe of the environment you're in. And that can be used for trivial applications, like somebody's trying to show off furniture and show you what it would look like if it was in your space. It's also got a significant impact on the augmented reality, because one of the biggest issues there is being able to accurately place something. So it's easy to go on YouTube and find web demos of extremely high resolution rendered objects, but then as long as they're floating in thin air, it looks real. The moment the system tries to place them on a tabletop or a surface, all of a sudden you can tell right away it's not real, because it's like sinking some portion of the way through. So the most advanced of these systems that are definitely at the industrial level, like in the CAD/CAM market, not in the consumer market yet, are using those time of flight systems to be able to accurately position things. And it seems like something small, but it's one of the key obstacles to creating a suspension of disbelief for people when they're using them, the AR systems. And of course, nothing beats the ability to walk into space and say that's up to about 30 to 60 feet across, and instantly build a three-dimensional model of that. That's got a lot of uses just on its own, especially for visual impaired, even people that are completely blind. So time of flight cameras are something that's definitely flying under the radar. There are going to be a lot of uses for that above and beyond.
Or under the LiDAR, as case
Under,
may be.
under the light bar.
Sorry, it's the second time you said that. And on your hack-proof toasters, guys, all I could think of is Marc has the recipe for the DoubleTree chocolate chip cookies, and if you're really nice to him, he might give that to you if you ask politely in the questions. Speaking of which, we do have some great questions coming in. But if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A session, and we will jump on them when we get there. And Marc, I know we're coming close to the 30-minute point, so we should kind of speed things up. I think you talked a little bit about the implantable biometric sensors, but talk a little bit about the use case here. And it looks like okay, here you're back. Okay.
T-Mobile is killing me today here.
Oh, negative shout out to service provider. Man, bad. Okay. But on that note, it really is going up and down for some reason. You can imagine, first of all, have a close look at that fingertip with the biometric sensors, and then think about all the intelligent ways you can be using these sensors so you can create on-demand sensor swarms, which Marc actually kind of talked about a bit earlier. And this one, oh my gosh, this has actually started to happen. In fact, I posted something on LinkedIn a couple weeks ago. the world's first Lou Gehrig's disease guy, a patient dealing with Lou Gehrig's disease, was able to post to Twitter using an implantable brain sensor, which is freaking amazing because those of you who have relatives or friends who have died of this awful disease know just what a prison it is. And the idea that, we can keep people can actually move cursors with their thoughts now is huge. And it's back to that indistinguishable Arthur C. Clarke, not Ray Bradbury, indistinguishable from magic piece. Um, we've talked a little bit about this whole notion of drones. I want to highlight something. The word tethered here is super, super important. The idea here is that AT&T is actually using tethered drones to create instant, disaster recovery cell sites. So if you've ever wondered how it is that somebody can be uploading uploading a video of the tsunami coming in right at that second, it's likely because AT&T has actually put those drones in a cloud up above or immediately upon relief when, FEMA or other agencies in the US come in. It's literally serving as a hovering network. And when you start realizing that whole concept is going to be super useful for all kinds of pop-up networks and everything else going forward, that becomes a very, very interesting use case for these, for the idea of these floating networks. We've talked, I think, a lot about the whole idea of future directions and use cases. Marc mentioned the idea of the handheld mass spectrometer, but this is an example I have to actually give Marc, which is, imagine you walk into McDonald's or Burger King or Wendy's, pick your favorite, and they have just announced that they are doing um, nothing but organic meat and eggs, and you flash your mass spectrometer on it and say, sorry, actually, the nitrogen analysis shows that these are not organically produced, and you are not living up to your promise, and walk out of the fast food restaurant. Now, leaving aside the fact that if you really want to eat organic, I would suggest you not eat at fast food restaurants. But the idea of being able to test things and know what they are, using these kinds of, micro intelligence and micro networked intelligence becomes really, really interesting. And I just want to highlight that second bullet item too, which is this concept of embedded security. So the idea is if the security is embedded end to end in that architecture that I showed you earlier, you get much deeper security than you currently have. Most of us who work in the IoT space are perfectly well aware that most of the IoT devices are not even a little bit secure. But that is in fact changing as companies are beginning to embed security in the chips, in the firmware, in the hardware, and in the cloud, as you can see here. Marc, are you back? Okay, Marc is officially off and grumbling to his service provider. Um, so a couple of other key points. The whole idea of Nielsen type focus groups. Many of us who are aficionados of military hardware and military uses are kind of freaked out by the fact that at this point in time today, American generals and admirals can tell you exactly what their soldiers and sailors are thinking and feeling based on the sensors that are in their gear. So they know when their heart rate goes up, when their adrenaline is spiking, all that stuff, which is creepy as all get out if you're a soldier. Now just imagine that's getting deployed in Nielsen's type focus groups. I have a friend who does nothing but focus groups, and his job is to read the body language of people in focus groups so that he's capturing not just what they say on the little forms that they complete, but actually how they're feeling. And I have to say, he's kind of creepy at parties because he's really good at his job. Now imagine if he got an assist from IoT devices, and you can see the potential for some of these technologies. And, finally, Marc has talked a bit about the contact tracing, but imagine the idea of these, swarms floating in the air above you and suddenly, turning on to say, eat at Wendy's. That is actually a possibility that our clients in the advertising space are actively pursuing as we speak. So, if you think in terms of what is the next generation IoT killer app, as much as we hate to use the term metaverse now that Facebook has co-opted, it's this notion of making the metaverse actually useful by seamlessly integrating the real world into the augmented reality world. And one of the things that's really interesting about this is that the metaverse will require the majority of its constructs to be created and maintained autonomously. So that means a lot of AI is getting poured into this so that where the real world leaves off and the virtual world picks up is actually going to have to be something that's handled by the intelligence of the system. Um, People crave novelty on that fourth bullet item. Marc and I often have conversations. Marc will maintain, and I'm going to credit this to him because if it actually happens, this is definitely Marc's thing, is that if you could take, for example, a zoo and instrument absolutely everything in that zoo so that you can have a real-time equivalent of that zoo experience, but you can be getting that through the 3D specs in your basement. People would go to the zoo in London or in Paris or in New York, and what I maintain is if I could go to the zoo and see Mark standing there in the zoo and be like, "Oh, hey, you're coming to look at the lions too," now there's actually no reason for me to actually physically get up and ever go to the zoo except that I happen to like it. But other than that, I would be an anachronism and you would actually have the ability to give that level of novelty in a virtual environment. Mark maintains that that's actually going to dramatically change the travel industry in lots of different ways. And I would love to see if he's right. Um,
In good
and
ways, I think it'll open. Hopefully, I'm going to be able to stay on for at least a few minutes at a time. Um, it'll encourage people to go off the beaten path because they'll be able to actually get a sense ahead of time of what the experience will be like, and then they can see how much that matches to them. But I think people like Zuckerberg underestimate the desire of people to be able to see something that's constantly dynamic and is also a direct reflection of reality as opposed to a construct. Constructs don't try and exploit us, they're not manipulating us, they're not trying to sell things to us. And for this to be genuinely useful as opposed to another socially destructive thing, the reality piece of it cannot go away. It's one thing to enter a game environment, which we already have. It's quite another to be able to have this make your life more positive, to allow you to see and do things that might be outside the reach financially or physically. It doesn't always have to be about money. Not all of us can make it to the top of Everest, but imagine being able to follow along and kind of be immersive and see it through somebody's eyes who does see it. And so those kinds of things I think will be the killer app, certainly for the metaverse. And it requires IoT. IoT will have to be pervasive in order to give us the level of reality that we need to suspend disbelief.
Talk to us a little bit about Helium and your favorite topic of distributed autonomous organizations,
The
because that's actually a hook for one of our upcoming emerging tech webinars. So please do talk about some of these.
So fingers crossed that I don't get cut off again. So Helium is an IoT startup that decided to provide wireless access, and the company is out of Europe. And the original intention was to be able to provide IoT devices that needed wireless connectivity in parts of the world where the government-owned telecom monopolies were very expensive. So it had a social component to it as well. It wasn't strictly a for-profit system, but it is a for-profit company. But part of the motivation for creating it was the social good that comes out of it. So their business model was to make the actual access points, but then to get people who already had internet connections, whether individuals or businesses, to install those access points and then plug them into their existing internet connection and create an overlay network. And they got reasonably far, but then they started to run out of money, and it was clear that the process that they were using wasn't working. And so what they latched onto was to create a DAO. And so they said, okay, we already don't own the actual overlay network. That belongs to the people who bought it. And they were collecting some small amount of money based on the number of devices that connected to it. So they kind of had the outline of something that you could plug into a DAO. And that's what they wound up doing. So they created this distributed autonomous organization where coins are generated based on the number of devices that connect to you and some amount of bandwidth. And that's their actual proof of coverage. So instead of things like proof of work or zero knowledge proofs or proof of stake, They just use proof of coverage, and you can't really fake that because the access points can tell for sure who is communicating with them, and they can see how many other access points are floating around if they're within range. They use long-range radio. It's much longer than Wi-Fi. They've got a range of several miles in those things. But the interesting part of it is that Helium turned over the entire management of that system and the collection of the funds to the DAO. And that was a way of kind of assuring people who were making the commitment to doing this that if Helium were bought by someone else, that someone else couldn't suddenly change all of the rules and then make the original motivations for participating in this null and void. Because anybody who buys Helium and decides to make a radical change, well, the DAO can simply say, we're going to turn off all of the APs, and you now have no business model at all, because it's Helium that gets paid by the IoT companies. Well, I should say the users, the people who buy the IoT devices and put them out. So that's kind of a really interesting.
Yeah. And you're cutting out again, Marc, so I will jump in. You are.
Go ahead.
I just want to highlight one thing that's actually kind of cool about DAOs is this whole concept of a self-governing organization put me in mind of something that literally 30 some years ago, I remember first learning about from a researcher then at Xerox PARC named Bernardo Huberman, who had invented a way to have, I think it was Sun Spark stations, create an autonomous election process to acquire computing resources from one another. So if I had an application I wanted to run and I needed computing cycles, I could go out and have my other Spark stations bid on it. And I remember thinking, gosh, the DAOs sound an awful lot like what Huberman does. And to my great delight, he is still involved in research. And that is actually one of the areas he continues to look at. So go Google him. He's a fun guy, Bernardo Huberman, and he is doing great research in this whole area of collective resource allocation. And Marc, I'm going to go ahead and sum up because we have some really good questions and we're running a little bit longer than we like. I think the big thing to think about is that the real impact of IoT is as an agent of entropy, which is good for those of us who hate everything getting too processed. Think about the difference between quantum mechanics and Newtonian physics, and that's basically the kind of transition we're getting hit with IoT. Popular science writers equate entropy with chaos and disorder, but really it is a system that has a massive amount of potential. So in fact, if you're living in your daily life and you think, crap, my life has a lot of entropy in it, please don't think that's a bad thing. It means your life has lots of possibility in it. As James Maxwell defines it, it's a system with more rather than fewer possible states. IoT allows the underlying foundational technologies to be combined in many more ways than if IoT weren't there. And in a very real way, it's a transformational technology. With that, I will highlight Marc under protest put in the hard copy photos of this rather than the videos. But this is a big teaser for episode 4, where we talk about a lot more of some of these things, so you can get some pictures of what this would look like. And just a reminder, we have a couple more questions while we have the thank you slide up. First of all, for the person who asked about standards, I was holding that in the back of my head. I wanted to make sure that I had that and I addressed that. A couple of standards to think about, especially if you're in the industrial IoT space. ISA 95 does have IIoT standards, but they are neither necessary nor sufficient for IoT generally. They are necessary for IIoT, but not broadly beyond that. In 2018, the International Organization for Standardization and the International Electrotechnical Commission co-developed the reference architecture, which is, and you can Google this, ISO/IEC 30141, which defines a common vocabulary and a set of reusable designs and industry best practices. So again, that's ISO/IEC 30141. Back in the US, the Internet Engineering Task Force and the Internet Research Task Force, the IETF and the IRTF, have been working on working on standards. The Lightweight Implementation Working Group within the IETF has several drafts on IoT networking, security, and power issues. And there are, if you Google RFC 8352, that's actually talks about some of the energy efficient protocol operations. The IRTF, which is more the research arm of the IETF, has just published RFC 8576, which is an overview of IoT security. In case you're wondering why I sound like I'm reading from something, I am. I did an article about IoT standards, and I pulled it up because we had the question. So hopefully that is more than enough. But if it's not, just go ahead and Google my name, Johna, Johna, Till, last name Johnson, and Tech Target, and some of my IoT pieces will come up. With that, we are getting very close to a wrap, but I do have to address, somebody asked us, Marc, for the DoubleTree cookie recipe.
Yep, I tried to post the link into the announcements.
It's okay.
It.
It's fine. Just email Marc at Marc with a C, at Nemertes.com. Again, that's Marc at Nemertes.com. Kind of the same thing that's up here, but Marc with a C, and he will get that link to you. And we'll also check out whoever asked that and get that directly to you.
And I did post it in announcements. The link is there, so if they can grab it,
perfect. Perfect. And with that,
we have to look for it.
And with that, we are at 1 minute over what we were shooting for. But thank you all for your patience with our technical difficulties. Hopefully, we've gotten you super inspired about this. And if you're interested in having your own series of presentations around emerging technology, come talk to us, because this is an offering we are happy to deliver to you and your organization. So just reach out to us at the research@nemertes.com. And if you would like to just follow along on Bright Talk, that's totally okay too. Just go ahead and register. You'll notice that that's one of the links. So just go ahead and register on the links for upcoming emerging technology talks. And with that, thank you, Marc, for your patience and persistence. And thank you all for listening.
Thanks very much to the audience. It's everybody out there who makes this worth it.
Thank you. Bye.